So as Father Brophy said, Megan and I are both recent graduates of the law school. So we're certainly not experts in philosophy, sociology, or theology, but we do consider ourselves to be excellent case studies in what it's like to grow up in the modern age with a lifetime of experience being millennials. Psychology professor Jean Twenge says that millennials tend to, as a very general rule, be more focused on themselves and less focused on things outside of themselves, likely due to the cultural movement towards more individualism. Unlike generations of young adults gone by, Dr. Twenge believes millennials might more accurately be described as Generation Me because they have never known a world that put duty before self. This is something we ourselves have experienced and that we hope to address in our presentation.
So the brainchild of this project that Suzanne and I are going to talk about was a directed reading that 6 law students did with Professor Rick Garnett last spring. And we read 3 different books that worked to diagnose the current ails in modern society from 3 different perspectives. And these 6 law students came from every different background and had every different belief along the spectrum. But what we all agreed on is that the diagnosis that our society was mobile and radically individual was accurate, and that the kind of doom and gloom that they were forecasting seemed to be up ahead. And what was more disconcerting is that as we were reading through these books, none of the authors were really offering solutions, or if they were not satisfying solutions. And as mindful young people about to engage in the world as young professionals, that was just not okay. So I brought a lot of these unsettled feelings back to our lunch group at the law school that became our studio. You'll hear more about it. And we spent hours talking about what do we do as we enter the world, and this project is a result of those conversations.
So today we're hoping to address the idea of forming virtuous friendships in response to this epidemic of unrootedness and rampant individualism in American society. And as Megan said, we're principally considering the diagnosis of individualism from Ben Sass's book Them and Patrick Deneen's book Why Liberalism Failed, both of which were published in 2018. So to start off, we're going to give a background on the theory of liberalism, drawing from Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen. And next, we're going to move into the practical ramifications of this mindset, focusing on Them by Senator Sass. After that, we're going to consider friendship as a way of addressing individualism, and we're going to use the definition of friendship from C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves. And finally, we'll give a brief background on the book A Severe Mercy, and then consider the friends in the studio, which is like the friend group in A Severe Mercy, as a way of addressing this problem of lack of community. So our hope is that you'll come out of this talk with a greater understanding of the modern approach to human freedom, a healthy skepticism of the ability of unconstrained liberty in the modern sense of the word to bring true fulfillment, and importantly, that you'll be inspired to take steps in your own life to create a community in which you can pursue the good life among family and friends for whom you have a sense of responsibility to and accountability for. So to start off, I'm just going to give a brief background on liberalism, and to clarify just the use of the term, when I say liberalism, I'm not talking about the modern sense of the term as like conservative, liberal dichotomy, but the classical sense. So the classical liberalism is kind of defined by emphasis on autonomy and freedom in the sense of lack of any constraints. It's just like do pretty much whatever you want as long as it doesn't interfere with those around you. So Professor Deneen talks about how the emphasis on autonomy leads to a lack of community because people are just worried about doing what's best for them and like not getting in the way of other people. And he talks about how this excessive emphasis on liberty erodes a sense of shared values, which in turn leads to a deterioration of the bonds within society, which is what we're describing as unrootedness. And this also leads to a weakening between generational ties to the area that you're from, and ties between members of families. And the macro effect of this is widespread loneliness and a sense of unrootedness, the lack of a meaningful identity and community, and increasingly isolated and transitory lifestyles.
So moving from that more philosophical academic perspective, Senator Ben Sasse published a book almost simultaneously with Professor Deneen's, which discusses the more practical ramifications of what liberalism has done in our society. And he talks about and focuses on the mobile culture in which we live, in which young professionals are encouraged and told that they should follow the next best economic opportunity, wherever it may lead and for however long it might last. And Deneen emphasizes that when you don't have any community, you're not rooted to one place or one group of people, there's an increase in polarization and an increase in the ability to dehumanize the people around you. So rather than being in a small town on a Friday night, looking around the crowd and seeing your coworkers, the people you grew up with, the people who are the parents of your children's friends, you just see people that kind of live in the same place. And rather than recognizing Sally down the way as your friend or someone you know, a part of your church community, you see Sally as the crazy, I don't know, maybe right-wing person who wants to build a wall, and that's all you know her for, and you have no reason to engage in a conversation, and if you disagree, to ask why she thinks that way. And as Sasse has said, and as I'm sure everyone in this room has experienced, that is not a welcoming community and not something that fosters a sense of relationship with one another. So Deneen says, Sasse says that when we have this increase in polarization and lack of community, we've started to create our own public squares on technology. And those public squares have gotten smaller and smaller because we're choosing the people that engage in the conversation and the sources of the media. So you're able to create an echo chamber that either tells you, A, we're always under attack and no one ever agrees with us and everything is terrible, or I'm always right, everything I think is true, and there's no reason to think that there's someone pushing back on me. So between Deneen and Sasse, there's a pretty bleak image of what society is like, and especially for young millennials like ourselves, the world we're about to enter into.
And as we said, we agreed with this diagnosis, but we were left feeling kind of empty-handed as to how to address it. So we started to consider friendship as a way of addressing this issue. And I'm going to briefly define friendship drawing from The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. Lewis considers friendship to be the least natural of the loves, and said because it's not necessary, but rather is the result of choice and shared interests. He says that friendship has no survival value, but is rather one of those things that gives value to survival. Lewis defines the beginning of friendship as that moment when you're with someone and you just think, what, you two? I thought I was the only one. He says it's when two persons discover that they share the same vision, and instantly they stand together in an immense solitude. For Lewis, what's important for friends is not that they necessarily agree on everything, but that they agree that the same things are important. They care about the same truth. And it's the idea of caring about the same truth that really caught our attention and was one of the facets of the studio, which we'll describe in a moment, that made it stand out to us as uniquely capable of fostering deep friendships, a group of companions who can spontaneously enter into friendship in pursuit of the good, realizing that they're all travelers on the same quest, sharing a common vision.
I'm not sure how many people here have read A Severe Mercy, so if you haven't, we're going to give you a brief run through, and if you should read it at some point. So the studio, or St. Udio's, is a brief vignette in A Severe Mercy, which is an autobiographical work by Sheldon Van Auken that tells the true love story of himself and his wife, Jean Davis, who goes by Davy. And as a part of this story of their life, they end up at Oxford, and where the couple encounters Christianity practiced by friends who took their faith seriously. And Davy and Sheldon, as atheists, realized their new friends were all at once highly intelligent, civilized, witty, fun to be with, and Christian. And they encounter authentic faith that helps them to truly begin grappling with the idea of conversion. And while they're at Oxford, they live in a small studio apartment named St. Udio's, mimicking the faith-based colleges at Oxford. And it was simultaneously a beloved apartment as well as a group of people in community whom they looked back on with fondness. It was a physical space and an intangible connection among people, where following their recent conversion to Christianity, Davy and Sheldon sought to grow in the knowledge of truth, of faith, and of living life with others on the same journey. They describe the studio as a center of a lively life in Christ for a great many people, where literally hundreds passed through at some point during their years there. And the conversation in the flat was filled with poetry, both classics and originals, hundreds of various scholars engaging in earnest conversation. And the groups were both large and robust and small, intimate conversations between circles of friends who they describe as Catholics, evangelicals, atheists, and all shades of betwixt and betweens. And it's important for the story and for our model that St. Udio's is not just a temporary space confined by four walls or a particular set of people. Rather, it was a time for them to take in, as they were in this lively community, to build themselves up, to learn, and to grow in their knowledge of truth and of faith before there was a season of life where they had to go out and give out. And I think we've all experienced that. It's very apostolic. But what is important is that studio remained a place where they could return back into and plug back into as they engaged in their lives outside of the world to check in and to remain true to who they were and what they believed.
So how do we go about creating our own studios? We don't live in Oxford, so we're not surrounded necessarily, maybe some of you at Notre Dame, but by the greatest minds. And it can be hard to even find like-minded people or people who are willing to discuss the ultimate questions in life. So just to take a step back, I want to say what we're not doing. We're not trying to address the issue of liberalism or a hyper-individualistic society on a macro level. We hope someone will do that, but we don't feel qualified to be the ones. But we are considering friendship as a way to make like a micro change in your personal life, and we hope that there will be a macro ripple effect from this.
And one other disclaimer is we know that it's not a novel concept to make friends. That comes pretty naturally to most of us. But what we do think is somewhat distinct about this is the intentional manner in which we're calling and asking you to engage in friendship with the people around you, prioritizing true leisure time as something inherently valuable in and of itself, and finding a community that's committed to pursuing truth and dedicated to asking and answering difficult questions with one another. So finally, we're going to get into our model of the studio. First, we're going to give you a prerequisite that we think all young people need to engage in and be prepared as an individual before entering into community, and then 5 elements of a modern studio.
So as Megan said, the first we're going to discuss a prerequisite. We think it's important to take a step back and reflect on what ways just the kind of liberal, individualistic mindset in the background of our society might be affecting your decision-making. Think about what you want your true end to be in life, and then consider if your decisions, both large and small, the way you spend your time, are really reflecting what you say your values are. So maybe all of your decisions are oriented towards like making the best resume, but you consider faith and family to be your paramount values. Just do like a self-check and see if your values are reflected in your decisions and the way you spend your time.
So once you've gotten right with yourself, you can start to make your own studio community. And our first element is that in this community, you need to take steps to create a group of friends who have the courage to ask and answer big, heady questions, those ultimate questions about culture, faith, life, what's truly important. As a caveat, though, these need not always be philosophical conversations. We recognize that not everyone loves to engage in armchair philosophy and theology to the extent that we do, but it can be practical concerns of how do I be a good Christian Catholic, fill in the blank for you, and also a good professional? How do I balance family and friends and job? What do those things look like? But we do encourage you, even if philosophy is not your thing, to be asking those deeper questions and find friends who maybe that is their thing and can help fill in those gaps for you along the way.
And then secondly, this is a very practical point, prioritize time for relationships with new and old friends, people who live near and far. Make time for those phone calls, FaceTime chats, inviting people over to your house for dinner. And then also, this kind of goes to the reflecting on how your values are reflected in your life. But learn to really value leisure and time spent with friends in and of itself. Don't consider that like, oh, I wasn't productive at all today. I just spent time with my family. Realize that really that's one of the most important things you can do.
Third, and going along with asking big questions and making time, is making sure that you're providing a space for growth, learning, mistakes, and errors. One of the values of having a studio is you can engage and ask and answer those difficult questions that society is either telling you not to ask or that there's only one answer to, and you can't engage in the minutia of things that maybe aren't politically correct or what society wants you to believe. So this needs to be a space where you can ask those difficult questions and you're received with an opening ear and a willingness to talk, but also to make mistakes and say, I think this might be right, maybe it's not, and to help each other along the way in learning and growth so that you are able to engage with society at large when those bigger questions are asked of you, because the day will come.
And then also set an example of modeling this trusting behavior by being honest with things that you may be doubting or struggling with, trusting other people to like respect your opinions, your worries, and to give their honest feedback. And then also, of course, be willing to share the good things that are happening in your life too, and have this be a space where you can celebrate together as well as build one another up when you're having a hard time.
And then our last element of a modern studio is that just like the studio in A Severe Mercy, this should be a space where you encourage one another not to be unduly swayed by the world in either how you approach life and its decisions and how you plan your career or take the next step. Especially as young professionals, the world is telling you that the only thing that you should be considering is how to climb the ladder, build the resume, make more money. And your studio should be a place that says, you know, maybe this is an opportunity that does those two things, but maybe it's a time to say no to that and to really encourage coming together or building yourself up as a person looking to heaven rather than to the next paycheck. C.S. Lewis has a great quote about friendship groups that we think really encompasses this last point. He says, "Alone among unsympathetic companions, I hold certain views and standards timidly, half ashamed to avow them and half doubtful if they can after all be right. Put me back among my friends, and in half an hour, in 10 minutes, these same views and standards become indisputable."
So just to finish off, we don't want to decry the present age as uniquely challenging. All ages have their challenges. But we do think that one of the present age's zeitgeist is an excessive emphasis on individuality. And we want to propose that by intentionally finding others with whom you can pursue the good and setting aside time for leisure in which to contemplate the ultimate things, it's possible to find true rooted community even in the midst of our transitory lifestyles.
So we look forward to your questions and our fellow presenters.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was, whoever put this conference together did a really nice job, because that was an incredible segue. Oh, all right.
Oh, good title.
Yeah, right? More Lewis for the Lewis fans out there. Oh, I need my clicker. All right. So I remember sitting here on campus at Notre Dame 2 years ago, and it was the first year of my time in the MDiv program. I'd set up my books and computer in Geddes Hall, and I was ready to get down to work before another class. But not surprisingly, I made a quick visit to my Facebook newsfeed before getting down to business. And there, I saw that a family member had posted a video on his wall, and he afforded it pretty high praise in the caption. So I clicked play. One of the first frames of the video was a close-up of a person's journal. And through my headphones, I heard a woman speak. Quote, "It sounds dumb, but I was considering not writing this in here because I'm embarrassed. I really don't want to be a lesbian. I'm more bi than that. I need you to help me. I need someone to talk to about this. I don't know. Help, God, please." I froze and was seized with a totally ludicrous fear. Is that my journal? Who was this person who wrote almost exactly the same thing that I did on numerous occasions? I kept watching, and I learned that this woman was a young adult Catholic like me. She loved Jesus, and she loved the church. And she had also experienced the crushing shame of having a secret that she didn't know what to do with, namely, attraction to other women. Her story felt like an intrusion into the secretive places of my own heart. But this intrusion also came with an invitation to friendship. After checking out the website attached to the video called the Eden Invitation, of which I'll share more about later in this talk, I nervously reached out for more information. A member of the team set up a phone call and asked me about my story. And I had no idea where to begin because I had never considered my experience of attraction to women as a story worth telling. I found myself naming things that I had never said before out loud. As I shared bits of my story, I heard this person on the other line respond with things like, "Oh yeah, I totally get that." For me, this was a paradigm-shifting experience of Lewis's description that was just shared of friendship. The typical expression of opening friendship, he says, would be something like, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." In this case, I had never met another Catholic woman who was open and honest about her experience of same-sex desires and who was striving to live according to a traditional or biblical sexual ethic. This conversation was my first step into a Christian community in which I knew I belonged with this experience and not in spite of it. And now, 2 years later, the community has been instrumental in my understanding of belonging in the larger body of Christ. Today, I'm going to share examples of stories and statistics and spiritualities that can help us explore together the enormous power of friendship, not only to affirm the goodness and dignity of particular persons in their experience of same-sex desires or gender discordance, but also to foster a tangible sense of connection and belonging to the broader body of Christ. Before we dive in, I'd like to make 2 brief notes. First, I'll be sharing a lot of statistics today about the experiences of LGBT people, and I want to encourage all of us to remember the real people and real stories behind these statistics. As my own rich Catholic tradition teaches, people are not to be used as a means to an end, and neither are their stories or their experiences. So I hope that this data can empower person-centered pastoral approaches and not to be used as material to support ideological arguments. Also, regarding language, in my own story, I tend to use the language of the experience of same-sex desires, but I'll reference material that speaks in terms of LGBT people, and I'm using the term today as cultural shorthand, not to suggest that a person is exhaustively defined by his or her experience of attraction or experience of gender. With that, let's begin. So, statistically speaking, churches today are not widely known for creating spaces of belonging among people culturally identified as LGBT. In fact, 91% of millennials think that the Christian church is anti-homosexual. What's more, in his groundbreaking and comprehensive study detailed in his book, Us versus Us, Andrew Marin found that while 86% of LGBT Americans spent their childhood in church, more than half left their religious communities as adults. Clearly, in both popular perception and in the actual experience of LGBT people, it's perceived widely that belonging to a church body and being somewhere on the LGBT spectrum are incompatible, or at least highly painful and fraught realities. While I personally never left Catholicism, I did have a very difficult season in my life when I felt like this incompatibility rang true. I'm a graduate student in theology, so I have certainly heard and understood my particular tradition's teaching on same-sex desires, that the inclination is disordered, but I am not, my person is good. I understood that none of my unwilled inclinations, however strong, were grounds for moral culpability. Intellectually, I got it. But for a long time, I didn't feel it. I didn't know what the solution to my seemingly unshakable shame would be, but there were certainly days and weeks when the thought of leaving the church seemed like an option worth considering. For those who do leave the church in order to resolve whatever tension they're dealing with, Marin found that the most common reason that LGBT people cut ties with their religious community is negative personal experience. Sorry. Where's my other page? Aha, got it. This category surpassed concerns about theological considerations and institutional misgivings. Marin has found that particular personal encounters most often motivated an LGBT person to leave their church. The most significant individual response that fell under the label of negative personal experience was did not feel safe in their religious community. What could it mean not to feel safe? Some of the specific responses to Marin's study included the following. Before the participant came out and anyone knew their sexual orientation, their faith community's dominant narrative about LGBT people emphasized condemnation to hell. Participants worried if they confided to anyone in their faith community about their orientation and spiritual journey, they would be outed. Participants lacked self-worth in two forms. One, for those who were not out, internalizing the condemnation they were hearing, and for those who were out, continually having to justify their sexual orientation to those around them. So the theme here has to do with communication, with trust, and with being treated like a person worthy of respect. But there's good news here, and it's so good that Marin and his team had a hard time believing it. They found that 76% of religiously raised LGBT Americans are open to making a return to their self-reported religious community. In his book, Marin makes a rough calculation based on his interpretation of random polling data and estimates that this percentage might reasonably account for 8 million people. What did the survey participants say might make them return? While by and large, negative personal encounters drove many away, it is positive personal encounters that would influence exiled LGBT people to return. And here are the top 6 most consistently reported elements that would need to be present for someone in this category to consider returning. Feeling loved, given time, faith communities' change in theology, no attempts to change their sexual orientation, authenticity, and the support of family and friends. Accepting the 8% of people who would return upon a change to their community's theology, this data is a modest request that churches be communities that are loving, patient, realistic, authentic, and supportive. Given a real human experience of these values within their church, many LGBT people suggest that they might feel like they belong. This data reminds me of a story of a young woman I met on an Eden Invitation backpacking trip this past summer. That is not a stock photo. That was actually where we were. At the end of the trip, she shared that in the midst of wrestling with her experience of same-sex desires, she asked God to give her a very clear sign that she belonged in the church. Her experience of the backpacking trip, she said, was the sign that she had been praying for. The week itself was very simple. It included hiking in the mountains, praying and receiving the sacraments, and growing in friendship with other Christians who shared her experience. But through these moments of connection, including many "what you too" moments, she felt tangibly that she belonged in the church. In the Second Vatican Council's dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, the church is called the people of God. This young woman's story illustrates quite beautifully that when particular people of God are loving, patient, realistic, authentic, and supportive, that means that the church is all of those things. These statistics and stories illustrate the sacramental power of friendship, its power to transform shared trials into bonds of connection, and its power to assure previously isolated individuals of their rightful place in the broader body. It is my experience that what Henry Nouwen writes of the Eucharist can also be said of particular friendships within the church community. He says that the Eucharist is that sacred mystery through which what we lived as a curse, we now live as a blessing. Our suffering can no longer be a divine punishment. Jesus transformed it as the way to new life. When we lift the cup of our life and share with one another our sufferings and joys in mutual vulnerability, the new covenant can become visible among us. In my own painful seasons of sorting through my personal experience, my perceptions of what others might think of me, and my difficulty in hearing the voice of God through it all, the cup of my life certainly felt more like a curse than a blessing. The words from the video, "I really don't want to be a lesbian," constituted some of my own most intimate fears for several years of my life. But friendship has become that sacred mystery through which, in being received in my complex unrepeatability, I have tasted the joyful cup of belonging. Brené Brown defines connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel heard, seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. If the Eucharist is our most powerful means of connection in the church, and if we truly become what we receive, as St. Augustine says, then that connectivity should become a felt reality by everyone in Christ's body. Through seeing, hearing, and valuing those in our church communities who experience same-sex desires or gender discordance, we foster connection, and our friendships become Eucharistic. Our oneness in the body of Christ becomes real, a felt reality. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I'll end by sharing a bit more about one model within the Christian ecclesial community for creating spaces of Christ-centered friendship and connection for those who experience same-sex desires and gender discordance. Eden Invitation was founded in 2017 by Anna Carter and Shannon Ochoa, who is with us this morning. While part of the same circle of friends in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they experienced a "what, you too" moment around their shared experience of same-sex desires. They both wanted to see spaces in the church where young adults could be honest about the longing in their hearts, while also spurring one another on to an integrated and resurrected life in Christ. Eden Invitation takes seriously Pope Francis's call to receive one another as holy ground. In Christus Vivit, he says, "Each young person's heart should thus be considered holy ground, a bearer of seeds of divine life, before which we must take off our shoes in order to draw near and enter more deeply into the mystery." At Eden Invitation, this happens in three distinct ways. First, each person who reaches out to Eden Invitation with this experience is invited to share their story either in person or through a video call. Our commitment to face-to-face encounters fosters connection in an experience and a cultural moment so prone to isolation. In my own experience, speaking my secrets out loud and being received as holy ground was a turning point in realizing that Jesus was not ashamed of me, and thus his body, the church, was not ashamed of me either. Secondly, we practice this through book clubs, online confidential book clubs using a video call platform, usually 7 to 10 people. The books we select deal broadly with themes of discipleship. We read Henry Nouwen, C.S. Lewis, Carol Houselander. Because everyone in the book falls on the LGBT spectrum in some way, it's an empowering space to explore the particular aches and blessings of the shared experience, but always within the context of our broader mission as baptized children of God. And finally, through in-person retreats, encounters, and community gatherings, we get together to pray and grow in friendship and to be nourished as we go out and live our diverse and varied vocations in the world. Thank you very much for receiving these incredibly simple, but I hope enriching reflections on friendship and belonging in the body of Christ. Many LGBT people estranged from the church are asking for ecclesial communities to be loving, patient, realistic, authentic, and supportive. The failure of our churches to be these things is truly cause for lament. But this failure has also become an opportunity to let the Holy Spirit conform our communities more closely to the radical receptivity of Jesus Christ. It's an opportunity to become what we receive in drinking the cup of belonging. And this does not at all require a program. It starts with regarding the one person in front of us as the holy ground that he or she is. When someone gifts us with their story, their pain, or their questions, we can begin by taking off our shoes. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me, or is it good? Powerful mic. All right, I see we're in the book club portion of the conference. For those of you that arrived early enough, there was a takeaway. It's not a handout, but a takeaway that was passed out. I'll explain more at the end, and if you don't have one, I will take your email and send it to you. So, a little over a decade ago, my, at the time, fairly new to me husband, a professor at a small Catholic liberal arts university in Houston, said to me, "We're going on sabbatical, and I think we should do it in South Bend, Indiana." At the time, I had visited South Bend a couple of times for a week or two. I knew a few of my husband's friends, which I see sitting here, but I didn't have many connections. People in Houston, home to 2.5 million people, kept asking me, what was I going to do in a city of 100,000 people? But it was in the trough of the recession. I'd been relieved of my fancy change management consulting job. Fellowships had dried up, but we owned a home in South Bend, and life was less expensive there. So off we went, and about what to do there, I would figure that out when we arrived. At the time, I also just so happened to be enamored with Book 8 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the one on friendship. I was convinced if we taught it in junior high, it would help teens resist peer pressure and allow them to avoid the type of emotional pain that comes from confusing a friendship of utility for a friendship of the good, or even worse, confusing someone that wished them ill with someone that could be called a friend. I was also taken with Aristotle's discussion of friendship because during my time as a non-traditional student at a small Catholic liberal arts college, it was the reading of this text, along with Plato's Symposium, that clarified for me the nature of a romantic relationship that I had been in. I promptly broke up with my boyfriend, found my now husband, and married him. Take that, people who claim philosophy is less practical than business. I had wanted to read all of the ethics, but I had not had the time during my course of studies because I had been working a full-time job as well. I also know myself. I am an extrovert. Give me a book or bring me a person, the person will always win. As much as I admire my bookish friends, I'm better at finding bookish friends than reading books myself. The desire to make friends and the desire to engage more fully in the contents of the Nicomachean Ethics merged into a single idea. I know. I'll trick people into coming over to our house. I will ask them to bring a friend, and I will set out some cheese and some wine, and we'll read the ethics together. And instead of calling this Aristotle reading group, we will, as a priest friend of ours suggested, call it Aristotle Drinking Club. Because, as he so rightly pointed out, that sounds like a lot more fun. When embarking on any endeavor, it is good to consider what might be the friction points or barriers to entry. What are those things that might get in the way of people attending? I mean, if I wanted to make some new friends, then I was going to have to make it easy for people. Having intermittently attended a Chesterton reading group in Houston, I knew the perils of a book club. The fact that you had to read ahead of time might mean either staying up till 2 a.m. the night before to finish the reading, as I did with The Ball on the Cross and The Man Who Was Thursday, or simply not showing up because there had been no time to read. Reading groups are fraught with guilt. Then there's the burden of having to bring food or beverage. We did not want people to not attend because they had no time to bake artichoke spinach dip, and we did not want or have time to go to the store. We solved the problem by framing ourselves as the original no-guilt reading group. Come when you can, leave when you need to, bring something to share some of the time, invite your friends anytime, and so supplied by a weekly grocery store run for cheese, wine, coffee, and chocolate, we began. We read out loud, passing the book from one person to another, after a few paragraphs, pausing to talk and ponder in between. We met weekly at 9:05 p.m., which allowed one of our founding members to put his children to bed before coming over. And over the course of the year, so rich was the discussion, we had not even made it to Book 8, the ostensible motivating factor of the entire enterprise. People who had heard of each other through mutual friends met in person. People who intended to see each other more often but got too busy did get to see each other. And Aristotle Drinking Club, at Aristotle Drinking Club, and I got my much-needed community. It is important to remember that my number of connections were relatively few to start. Fortunately, however, the people I knew many others, and they responded to the constant reminder to bring a friend. The attendees grew to a mix of graduate students of all disciplines, university professors, university staff, and people with no personal connection to academics like me. After a while, we experienced Aristotle fatigue and widened our scope to include Aristotelian texts, which I broadly defined as books whose authors think that this table is here, that reality is a thing, and happiness might have something to do with something with virtue and excellence. We read Leon Cass, Walker Percy, ventured into Aristophanes' The Clouds, singing the choruses, etc. The weekly cadence brought with it an ebb and flow. Not everyone came all the time, but we were there weekly. Interspersed, we held larger gatherings and parties. Good things do not last forever. We do, after all, live in a fallen world. And after I'd been living in South Bend for 4 years, I had to move back to Houston. We would return in the summers and for another sabbatical. We had not thought much of Aristotle Drinking Club outside the enjoyment it brought. But then, when it was time for us to move away, people started making comments about how sad they would be to see us go. But the sadness was not only about me and my husband individually, but about the role we played in, quote, elevating the social life of the community. We had been accidental handmaids to connection. As we were building up a community for the sake of our own flourishing, we were doing so for others, strengthening a weave already there and bringing people who may have been only had ancillary knowledge of each other into closer orbit. I began to reflect upon the experience and realized that there was more going on than merely tricking smart people into reading and discussing Aristotle around me. We were recovering another bit of ancient wisdom, the recipe for building community. The three main ingredients in our case were these: occasion, proximity, and repeated person-to-person interaction. Let us consider each in turn. Occasion. When you start a new job or go anywhere, you meet people, and then you may meet the people they know. But without a place and a repeated occasion, you cannot easily funnel these casual interactions into something more lasting. Many people find that college was the last place where they were able to have this type of environment. It was the ever-proximate structure of a campus which housed a dorm, the classroom, the library, and even eating establishments. So how are we to replace that structure? For some, it can be found in a CrossFit gym or a church. But given the number of people floating through an increasingly fragmented, hyper-individualized world, hungry for increased connection and communities, these brief forays are not nearly enough. Factors such as the tension between economic upward mobility and the requirement to be nomadic to access this upward mobility weakened our familiar connections, and post-World War II, car-centered cultured cities took care of the rest. The online world entered with its promise of connection, but we find too often the flatness of digital life acts as an oft-compelling simulacrum of actual community, but it lacks the robustness of in-person interaction. I have nothing against technology. Indeed, I work for a tech company. But the telos of purpose of such things like Facebook, text, and chat should bring us face to face with each other, not engage algorithms that pull us ever further into a world that cannot offer us the embodied connections we need, or curate to us the uncomfortable differences of opinion that G.K. Chesterton believes to be an important ingredient in what he calls good, quarrelsome friendships, but instead locks us in a room where we are served up only that which is likely to incite a click or a purchase. Also, think about those people you run into during the course of your life. You know, the ones you say, we should grab coffee sometime. You know how this goes. You probably run into them and say it at least 3 times before the coffee actually gets scheduled, if ever. Having an event like this lets you say instead, hey, I do this really cool thing at my house. I'd really love it if you would join us. I think you would like the folks here and find the topics interesting. It makes getting together easy. No new thing to schedule, just that thing you're already doing. Proximity. Now let me say a little about proximity. In my title, I mentioned the ideal city. Although many have written books on what constitutes an ideal city, I will take my definition from new urbanists and people like Jane Jacobs and say broadly, for the purpose of this talk, that the ideal city is a walkable, mixed-use place where 75% of our daily needs are located with a 10-minute or quarter-mile walk. Our homes would have front porches or stoops that address a street in such a way that repeated happenstance interactions are facilitated. And for bonus points, the city would be speckled with a litany of third places, those places that are neither home nor work, where you can stumble upon familiar and soon-to-be familiar faces. But As this is a fallen world and a corrupt culture, most of us do not live in the ideal city. But we should note that one of the key characteristics of an ideal city is proximity, and that we can have access to. Why is this so important? Consider the city you find yourself in now. While living without a car, or at the very least a bicycle, is a problem in South Bend, most places are within a 5 to 10 minute drive. Distance is one of those friction points or barriers to entry, especially since most of us have overscheduled lives. Most people we know and who regularly attended Aristotle Drinking Club were within a 5 to 10 minute drive, which makes it easy to attend, and the super far away people were 15 to 20 minutes. Contrast this to Houston, where some of our nearest friends are 15 to 20 minutes, and it's easy to spend 30 minutes to an hour on the highway to see a friend. Repeated interaction and a little more on occasion. You may be asking, does it need to be a reading group? No. We returned to South Bend a few years later for another sabbatical. By that time, I was back to working as a consultant, and my job had me on the road Sunday through Thursday night. A weekly event would not work for me, but our return to the city had brought about a request for the return of Aristotle Drinking Club. We knew we should do something. The solution that presented itself was to invite over some of our interesting friends to give informal talks to a group of us in our living room with discussion to follow. Thus, the idea for South Bend Salon, Interesting Topics by Interesting People, was born. It was an evolution of Aristotle Drinking Club, but this time there was no reading because there was no book. The salon concept required more coordination because as organizer, I had to now arrange for the presenters. This extra work yielded different rewards. We selected speakers through a combination of reaching out and asking specific individuals and soliciting people to volunteer. We tried to balance the topics between theory and practice, academic and non-academic, explicitly Catholic and not, and vary the format between interactive workshop, presentation with and without visual aid, and talk show style interview. Having mingle time is also important, so we scheduled time for informal conversations before and after. We retained the bring a friend and capture emails for new people to include in the invite. Salon started off as a third Thursday of each month thing, which worked during the sabbatical year, but when we returned for 3-month summer, the pressure of wanting to fit more in less time, the erratic nature of my schedule, and presenter availability blew the neat third Thursday structure away. We moved to a whenever on whatever night, but not more than once a week, and planned a season, like a symphony or a ballet or a British TV show might have. Something else special happened inside the structure of Salon. I soon recognized that especially in a place like South Bend, where so many individuals moved here because their spouse became a professor, and the non-professor spouse was often brilliant, perhaps even PhD'd themselves, and did not have a reliable platform or organizational affiliation. The salon quickly became a place for those people who had a lot to say and share a place to shine, and become known and seen more fully by a community that may or may not have known that person as deeply as they thought. Whatever your event, there will be frequent flyer miles such as this, and I urge you to pay attention when you see them and work to facilitate them purposefully. I define a frequent flyer mile as any ancillary benefit that comes from an action that was not the main intention that drove the initial action. Some may say, well, selecting readings or inviting speakers sure seems a bit burdensome. Wouldn't a weekly happy hour do? While it is true that doing something regularly on some sort of cadence, be it weekly or as a season, is important to reinforcing relationships, my experience also points to the importance of a conceit or a reason to come together outside of just coming together. The conceit or the occasion is important especially for those who are perhaps less comfortable in an open format type gathering where small talk might be required. It also removes the barrier of perceived in-crowd. It might be uncomfortable to be the new person showing up to a gathering of people who are already friends, whereas showing up to a group united by a common interest is likely more comfortable. Neither Aristotle Drinking Club or South Bend Salon is perfect. The danger of Salon is it being reduced to the draw of the topic or the presenter. Regarding Aristotle Drinking Club, we found out later there had been an additional barrier to entry that we had not considered. Not everyone's interested in Aristotle. And some people felt self-conscious about their own level of education, which hadn't occurred to me. A person who follows the advice always aimed to be the dumbest person in the room. evidenced by me being here in the room with all of you. By removing the difficult book element, we opened up things a bit more. I'm sure there are countless other formats and conceits. I have yet another, bourbon in a book, short stories, long shots that I have yet to get off the ground. My goal here has been to have you get your own creative juices flowing and think of your own format, but allow me to repeat the three key ingredients: occasion, proximity, and repeated connection. These provide phenomenological structures for what I call an overarching architecture of being. What is that? Many of you are likely familiar with Churchill's oft-quoted, "First we shape our buildings and then they shape us." Homes with minimal setbacks and pleasant porches fronting streets lined with well-used sidewalks that people use to walk to their daily activities certainly help shape our interactions by bringing us repeatedly face to face with each other. But there are also many not as easily visible but equally powerful structures that shape us, such as habits and conversations. There's the structure of time, the yearly calendar, the clock, when we do work, when we do not, which days we pray, what we pray. Language is a structure that both delivers our thoughts and structures them. Consider this example, the art of the introduction. The way we introduce people to each other has the potential to create a space where it is easier for people to be their best selves. The easiest way to show this is by example. Imagine you are at the aforementioned reading group or salon, and you are introducing two new people to each other. You could say, "Meet John. He is the managing editor for Notre Dame magazine and the father of my godson." Not bad, but contrast it with this. Meet John, one of the finest writers and interviewers that I know. You should see the excellent piece he wrote about Havana in Notre Dame magazine. Another example, this is Gloria, Rand's mother, versus this is Gloria, songwriter, poet, former copywriter, currently seeking her next career adventure. She is new to the area. You two should get to know each other. What is said when making a simple introduction can set the stage, direct the conversation, have an impact on how people view each other in the same way that a street curves guides us along its path. What is valuable to take away is simply this. There are such structures, and to the extent that we can identify them is to the extent that we can move out of our default mode, perhaps set by culture, into something more intentional, where we pick up the drafting tools and assume the role of architect, not the architect, not playing God, but rather design our lives, our lived way of being in the world, towards the end of facilitating communities that help us to be and live more virtuous and therefore more happy lives, wherein which the fruits of friendship are more plentiful and readily accessible. In conclusion, in this ever online, flat, digital, and overscheduled culture we are living in, a world where many cities, peoples are divided from each other by a tangle of traffic and distances, holding events such as this can be a catalyst to begin or reinforce friendships. To take up again the metaphor of community as a woven fabric, the individual relationships are the strands woven across, the weft, and the occasions where people meet and encounter each other comprise the stable, stationary warp, those strands on the loom through which the others duck over and under. So why deliver this paper here to you? Because I hope that you will be inspired to go forth, determine an occasion or conceit that is once an ends and a means, find another one or two people to own the occasion with you, invite your friends, people you encounter that might be future friend, ask them to bring theirs, add all new friends you invite to an invite list, introduce people to each other powerfully, prefer person-to-person interaction over virtual, and watch that technology is used in service of embodied connection versus allowing it to replace true connection with quote-unquote being connected in an online simulacrum. In the face of Supreme Court justice decisions, legal battles, and the ongoing culture war in the public square, this activity may seem small or even trivial. Think of it instead as a catalyst, something small but powerful. These simple things are rebellion. These small things make a big difference. Because these are small things, you can do them. Because we are creatures created for each other, created for community, we should do them. We are made better ourselves by doing so. Because loneliness and disconnection are rampant, we need to dedicate time and attention to weaving connections anew. Thank you. just real quick, if you didn't get a takeaway, I have a couple more, and otherwise I will can send you an email. It's just elements of a powerful introduction and some elements of repeated occasions.
We have a full 15 minutes for questions. Just open the floor.
I have a question about the size of a group. So when it is so open, when it's like invite all these people and whatnot, I mean, is there a number you want to try to stick to or not go above when you're trying to maybe have a group where you're having big discussions, kind of combining two of the talks, like about these big questions?
Sure.
Go first, I'll go second.
Yeah, I would say that we're not experts on the topic, and you might have more practical experience, but our group was kind of like an inner circle and then a wider circle. So we would have a group of about 5 to 6 of us that would gather very regularly and have these conversations. We were also hosting occasions or kind of organically having occasions with probably closer to 15, 20, 30 people in a wider context. And it was those 5 or 6 people where we were asking like the really hard questions and being the most vulnerable, but we were still engaging in kind of the broader themes with a larger group. So in my experience, it's a mix of both, kind of having an inner circle and then engaging and trying to create inner circles for other people around you.
Yeah, and I would say that we did have like a core group for Aristotle Drinking, and then for Salon, it was 3 people. And it just seemed like Aristotle Drinking Club was weekly, and it just sort of seemed that the ebb and flow, just kind of the nature of people's schedules and people are not able to make it every week, kind of kept it. Also, the size of our living room might have limited it a bit, but it never got too large. And even when we were spilling out of the living room and up the stairs and sort of into the dining room, there were enough of those connections from times when people had maybe met people once or twice along the way that people were comfortable enough to cluster. So I think because it's word of mouth, it's not a flyer anywhere, it's not in a newspaper or anything like that, that also kind of keeps it to a certain size.
How long does it take for you to get like buy-in from people, or like kind of get it to be like a regular thing versus like you're investing way more at the beginning of something that you might not like know would like play out, I guess, with people's interest?
For Aristotle Drinking Club, and actually we had a 4th person that was often there. It was actually pretty quick. I think people were interested and intrigued. I think it is good to have kind of a catchy title. Like people are like, oh, that sounds really fun. Like it should sound really fun, and not like work. And then I think people just really quickly and then other people told other people. So I think it's just important to be like hospitable. I don't know, maybe it's like a Texas gene thing, but just really welcoming and hospitable, and people will come.
I do think you have to be mindful when you're in a place like South Bend or maybe connected to a university setting. It can happen a lot faster just because people are naturally thinking about or engaged in academic or heady topics. But in my experience, even just moving to a city that's not connected, I'm not connected at all to an academic setting, it does take more time to kind of suss out the people around you who want to have those conversations. But I found that if I invite them over or I try to start the conversation on that route, most people will at least engage with you, maybe just to satisfy you, but you can start to kind of find them, but it can take a little bit longer to find buy-in and find the right people who actually want to have those conversations.
When I was an undergraduate here at Notre Dame, probably my not drinking club, but the community that I most enjoyed were the dorm masses, and I think probably most of us who have been students here would agree with that. I never went to mass at the big church. That's probably done. But I mostly enjoyed those weekly dorm masses. And then when I graduated, it took a while to try to find anything that was similar to that. Newman centers were great, but when you get into the big community, the big world, you don't have that. So, another story. I eventually left the Catholic Church, mostly because I didn't like the way they were treating women and LGBT people. And it was the theology, I think, that that I wanted to give my allegiance to a group that I so I joined the congregation. And our weekly services are very much, I think, like the kind of salons that we're talking about. That they're a place where a small group of friends get together and talk about things that are important and engage with the preacher, and then have coffee together. So my question is, do you think there's a role for, within the Catholic Church especially, a role for developing that kind of sort of weekly conversation from a church background?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great thing, and I believe it was Jean Vanier who spoke about kind of the structure of the church with different dioceses as a skeleton, and then individual parishes being kind of the flesh on the bones that really like gives life. And I think the parish is an under kind of regarded hub of things like Tamara and Suzanne and Megan are talking about. So I think looking to the parish as locations of this kind of conversational group is a great thing.
So can parishes develop that?
Yeah, I think people can develop that, and people are at parishes. So yeah, of course it depends on relationships with pastors and with pastoral staff members, but I think given time and given attentiveness to relationships, this is totally possible. Small group models. Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think one of the things we've talked about with the studio is this kind of wider vision of oftentimes, at least in my experience, Catholic churches speaking to groups of people our age are like, oh, Catholic singles night, bring them all together so they can marry off and go do the next thing. And that is a vocation and it's something we should be concerned about. But there is, I think, a thirst and a desire for just genuine connection and friendship in parish, not focused on a romantic end. So, but I agree that it's going to take some people like us in parishes saying, there's a desire for this. If you just put it out there, the people will come. And maybe it won't always be huge, deep conversations, but at least they're people who have some kind of common thread and a common telos that can come together to work that out. So.
And I think that Tamara made an excellent point about the idea of having something to talk about aside from like a point to gather other than just gathering. And that's something that Lewis emphasizes a lot in the Four Loves. He's like, you don't make friends because you want friends. You make friends because you're interested in the same thing. So like give people something to be interested in so that they can have something to talk about aside from just small talk. And that can help like create the community and shape that.
One and then two.
I come from a big city and people are in a real vortex of activity, and my experience with trying to bring together healthcare professionals has been very, very difficult because the first meeting people would come as a curiosity, but then I found that the group, and there was great thirst. It was, I felt like it was kind of successful. I felt the energy was good. But the young people who had jobs, families, both partners trying to work, etc., they were unable to continue to make it come. I mean, because it is a commitment to kind of join a group. And although they were really readily vulnerable in that very first meeting, they were unable to continue. And so, yes, I'm not sure what the answer would be, and I would be very interested. The group was around sharing in a prayerful way around the ethical conundrums that we encounter as healthcare professionals. And there was a lot of wanting to do that, but the only people that continued to come were two more middle-aged, semi-retired types like myself. So I wasn't really sure. Maybe you would have some insights that you would offer.
Well, it is interesting because in Houston, which is, people are very far away and things like that, that's the place where I haven't launched the next concept. I seem to always do it here because of the proximity. And so I've been thinking a lot about how to deal with proximity in large major metropolitan areas. And so part of it may be thinking about Do I locate sort of near where work is or something like that? Do I pick a third place or some other kind of location that's super easy to get to? Do I have to do sometimes like tweaking just a little I'm very tactical. Tweaking just like something in the logistics, like the time, like Aristotle Drinking Club was 9:05, because just of the schedule, but like trying to kind of get at like, what is it that's getting in the way of people getting there? And is it like, would it be better if we did it at somebody's house because then they don't need to get a sitter? And, it can be a little bit different because this is a group of people that is not just sort of word of mouth, friend of a friend of a friend, but sort of thinking through like really kind of getting down, almost like interview, like what is it that's kind of getting in the way to see, and maybe there's a larger group that meets like once a quarter, but maybe they're little enclaves of people that live kind of near each other. And they're kind of in little clutches or something and so just kind of, I think sort of dwelling in those friction points, I think would be useful. Or maybe there's a thing with kids and so we need a sitter or we need something fun for the kids to do while, so just really digging into that and being really creative and just experimenting and iterating on it until it kind of hits and not kind of giving up, especially if people are hungry.
I think also, when we're talking about topics so intimate and personal, such as like faith or ethical realities in our professions, it can be helpful if the shepherd or the guide of the group also pursues one-on-one conversations outside of the group context. And that's something that we do in Eden Invitation. So nobody enters a book club before having a one-on-one conversation with a member of the team. And in that way, they have a space to kind of maybe name some of those things that they want to talk about in the group, but don't really trust the whole group setting quite yet. And it kind of primes the pump a little bit. And if the leader, if you kind of know where they're coming from, and then you're sitting in the group context, they have that personal connection and maybe one more element of safety by seeing your face just every week. And it's a huge time commitment. Like even if your group is only 5 people, that's including yourself, that's 4 extra potential 1-hour cups of coffee. But I think it's just totally worth it in my experience to use the one-on-one as well. Yeah.
Last question right here.
My wife and I live in small town America. We live in a city of 11,000 people. And provided, because we never really wanted to live in a place like that, but because we do, those elements that you're talking about, Tamara, are naturally there. I see the same people in the grocery store that goes to my kid's soccer team, I see them in church. And so it's been able to really develop deep, strong friendships, life-giving friendships. For young people who, as you were saying earlier, they're always being challenged with deciding the next best economic opportunity. How do they really wrestle with seeking that and success with the possibility of going to rural America or a small town where those friendships can be more naturally established?
Yeah, I think if you look at the works by Patrick Deneen and Ben Sass, you'll see a lot of encouragement to make those moves to smaller communities and leave behind the big city mobile society. And I think that's a great option for people who are feeling called to do that and where they can feel like their vocational call is being fulfilled in those communities. But I do think it's a bit of a misnomer to tell all young people that the way that they can engage and live their vocational calling is to return home, in a sense, to those smaller Friday night communities. And so what Suzanne and I often are talking about and grappling with is society tells us that we need to be mobile, and if we feel like we're doing what God is calling us to do, sometimes that means we have to engage in the cog and be a cog in the machine a little bit. So you have to find ways to create small towns in the big places that you are. So whether that's through creating a salon, like Tamara is talking about, connecting to a national group, like Raquel is talking about, or just literally going into your church community and finding 2 or 3 people that you can find and say, you know what, you're my neighbor, both maybe literally, but also figuratively. And for us especially, it's utilizing technology rather than condemning it to say, I can't live by Suzanne, but we can FaceTime once a week and it's not the same as a person-to-person interaction, but we can at least check in, see each other, and see our wider group of friends, our studio. so that even when you're lonely or by yourself on the metro, whatever you're doing, you know that there's a group of people thinking and praying about you and the desires that you have on your heart.
Yeah, and I think additionally, it is actually a good long-term goal, even if you're in a city, to like just put down roots in the city and try to break it down and have your smaller community within the city. And also just ultimately to not shoot for moving around all the time and just taking everything because it's prestigious, but eventually like jump off the bandwagon and be like, okay, I like have kind of done what I feel called to do. And maybe some people are called to move around all the time their entire life, but I think it's easy to do it without being like discerning that that's what you're called to do, just like jumping on things because you're not being, mindful about it. But I think whether you're in a bigger city or a smaller town, it's good ultimately to kind of shoot to stay somewhere and like find a community and invest in that.
Yeah, we need to keep telling young people that moving to a small community is an option. It's a fulfilling option and it's a great option. You don't have to move to a big metropolitan area, which I feel a little bit hypocritical in saying that, but I think it is true. And maybe if I had heard that more often throughout my academic career, I would have made different choices. I can't say though from experience.
Well, please join me.
Awesome.